This is.
You can pass this down. I'm passing out so that all of you who are auditing know what the assignments are for the students who are taking the course for seminary. If you can pass the extras up to Reverend Decker here. And we'll I'm gonna get that door, please, Seth. All right, welcome back from the break. I just distributed the assignments that the students who are taking this course for credit have. The top of it, they have already received by email. Read the catechism twice, first aloud, meditatively, and then silently and taking notes of certain things. And also read the first 50 pages of H.H.'s Triple Knowledge. That's his introduction to the catechism and his explanation of Lord's Day 1. What I'm interested now is the assignment for Monday and Tuesday. First of all, for Monday, read Gordon Gerard's introductory sermon to Heidelberg Catechism Preaching. If I didn't hand that out to you, I have it available here. Ask me for it. And then number 2, go back to your notes from reading the Heidelberg Catechism regarding the personal experiential comfort themes and write a separate paragraph on each of those subjects on 3 different Lord's Days. That is, one Lord's Day for the personal, one for the experiential, one for the comfort. And with this purpose, to explain what a preacher will want to say in a sermon about these. That is the comfort emphasis of the Lord's Day, the experiential emphasis of the Lord's Day, and the personal nature of another. Be ready to report that next Monday. And reflect on how a sermon missing that note, personal, experiential comfort, would not truly be doing justice to the catechism and its purposes. And then read through the catechism again carefully, this time making notes of 4 places that the specific language of the catechism must be noted, and show how preaching on the topic of that particular Lord's Day without treating the language of that Lord's Day would result in a poor sermon. So there you don't have to read the entire catechism again, but select 4 Lord's Days where specific language of the creed is crucial. I'll just give an example, the doctrine of providence. You can look at Lord's Day 10, say that's the doctrine of providence, put the Lord's Day away, make a sermon on some Bible texts about providence, but you would not be doing justice to the sermon because you're not looking at the language of the catechism. Show specific language in 4 Lord's Days as to why it's important to look at the confession itself. And then do some preparation for the next 2 assignments. For Tuesday, you must listen to a catechism sermon by Reverend H. Hooksma. While you listen to it, you must take notes, but do not pause the recording. That is, I'm interested in you listening to it just as it would be preached. Secondly, read through the corresponding Swart manuscript. I'll show you those in a moment. They're on the table to your right. And write 1 page to present to the class on the comparison. And third, read the Triple Knowledge commentary on that same Lord's Day. And write 1 page comparing the 2. That is the sermon / Swart manuscript sermon and the Triple Knowledge explanation of the Lord's Day. Especially, I'm interested in explaining in what way the triple knowledge is not a sermon. When you preach the catechism for the first time, you're certainly going to be reading through triple knowledge. This is a caution for you not to think that what HH does in triple knowledge is what you must do in a sermon on the Lord's Day. What you listen to on the CD and what you read in the Swart manuscript will show that what he wrote in triple knowledge is not how he preached. The content is there. There will be many similarities, but you must not think that if nobody knew that you were cutting and pasting triple knowledge into your sermon manuscript, you could do that legitimately and say that's the Heidelberg Catechism sermon. It is not Heidelberg Catechism sermon. So any questions about the assignments for next week? Prepare as much in advance as you can for those next two assignments. Listening to a sermon by HH, reading the manuscript, handwritten manuscript of that sermon, and then reading triple knowledge on that same Lord's Day and writing brief papers with regard to them. Comparison. Any questions on that, Matt?
Are we to draw from the sermons you have?
Yeah,
Setting up there?
I'm going to go there right now. I'd like to go through my bibliography somewhat. And then that will call attention to what you need to do. You all have the preacher's bibliography that was handed out to you. I'm not going to read through everything in it, but I do want to read the note at the top. This is not an exhaustive, but rather a practical bibliography of works, number one, that are in English, number two, that are accessible, that is, available for purchase without mortgaging the firstborn, three, that are commentaries on the Heidelberg Catechism itself and works explaining the Heidelberg Catechism generally, and four are works that a Reformed pastor who preaches on the Heidelberg Catechism really ought to have in his library. So I divide the paper up into general works on the Catechism and then commentaries on the Catechism. The bottom of the second page is this note. There are many other works on parts of the Catechism available. So look for works on the Apostles' Creed, the Ten Commandments, the Lord's Prayer, sacraments, and so forth. Thinking along these lines opens one up to a lifetime of reading different explanations of the bulk of the Heidelberg Catechism's topics. Understand the point there. There may be someone who preaches through the Apostles' Creed or writes a book on the Apostles' Creed who doesn't even know about the Catechism. But that book still will be valuable for you as you preach through the Apostles' Creed in the Catechism. Same for the Lord's Prayer, same for the Ten Commandments. I have on these tables here by the windows and in the breaks or before you come in the week, in the days to come, many of the books that I have in my own personal library on Heidelberg Catechism. Our seminary library is going to have more than this. This is just an example of what I've had over the years. They are, first of all, some translations of the Catechism, some old commentaries for Sinus, for example, and some old Dutch, now translated into English, commentaries on the Catechism. Some are excellent resources that you will want to use for information. Others will be more foils. This is what they say about the Catechism. Really? You'll respond, but that will help you think positively about what you must preach. And then some other books on parts of the Catechism. For example, here are books on the Lord's Prayer, books on the Ten Commandments, and a nice newly published book by a Second Reformation divine, Budemans, called The Practice of Faith, Hope, and Love. The practice of faith is his explanation of the Apostles' Creed. The practice of hope is his explanation of the Lord's Prayer. And the practice of love is his explanation of the Ten Commandments. Now, this also may be somewhat of a foil because he's a Nader Reformatie man, a Dutch pietist, Second Reformation experientialism, guilty of that experientialism. Nevertheless, this is another older work recently published by Annemie Hotbeheer. She's the one that's translated some other things for the RFPA, hasn't she? Anyone know?
Wheeling goes back some form.
Yeah, very good. Willingness. So look over that table just for some ideas. There may be some there that are not here. Then on this table, I have first of all tapes and CDs of Heidelberg Catechism sermons by 4 or 5 different old Protestant Reformed preachers. The majority are catechism sermons by Herman Hoeksma. They're reproduced and doctored by Heritage Recordings. You're probably familiar with that. I've got all of these on old cassette tape that Tom Budweil and I recorded or copied for Reverend Baudenberg 40 years ago, almost 30, long time ago. They are remastered and can be listened to nicely on these CDs. There are a few by Skipper and Voss here. And then there are catechism sermons by Reverend Cordring and Professor Engelsma. I'll be bringing more sermons from Professor Engelsma. Part of your assignment in the days after next Monday and Tuesday are going to be listening to sermons by these men, outlining, reflecting on sermons that these men preach. If you don't know what this is, Jacob, it's a cassette tape player. This is a cassette tape. You put that little box in that. Right? And then there are the Swart manuscripts. I mentioned those earlier. I don't know if you've ever seen them. They are old photocopies bound now and duplicated of Martin Swart's handwritten sermons of H.H. I'm holding them here so that those on the internet or the recording can see. Beautiful handwriting. Every Lord's Day, he took down in shorthand and then went home and wrote it out in longhand. There's something like what is found in Righteous by Faith Alone, commentary on Romans, Martin Swart's handwritten copies. It's obvious that not everything H.H. said in those sermons is written down, but it's not so obvious how he could make it flow so well and not be everything that H.H. said. Because if you take, for example, these handwritten sermons and read them aloud, you can finish them in about 20 minutes. And though H.H. preached slowly, it was not that slowly. You listen to the tapes. Even in his older years, it was not so ponderous as you might think. It's not everything he said, but it's a good deal of what he said, and it's a nice example of what he did in Heidelberg Catechism preaching. There are 2 sets here. My own personal set I got from an old retired URC minister many years ago. His son is a member at Byron Center, and that's how I got it. And then there's the Seminary Archives copy. So 2 sets. There are 6 volumes. You'll just have to divide those volumes among yourselves when you look at them. Don't take them out of the building, please. I don't know whether anybody is making copies of them anymore. They're legal size paper. So the tapes of the sermons, the Swart manuscript, and you know how to find Triple Knowledge by H.H. Any questions about that or about the assignments?
Did anyone in the RPA or anyone in the seminary get the original copies of the Swart manuscripts?
That would be interesting to ask Chuck if we have those in the archives, but I don't think so. I think he would have shown me if the originals were in the archives.
Because the originals we were supposed to get
Okay?
for the library and the archives.
We can ask Brother Terpstra, do we have, or do we know where the original Swart manuscripts are? These are copies, obviously, but
Yeah, Professor Ingalls will still have some of them. And I think the family still might have some.
okay.
So the hardback,
It was-
hardcover,
my
right?
understanding that when we did work for the library, that on the death of Jim, who had possession of them, we were supposed to get them. I don't know whether that's true or not, or whether that's a fact.
I don't think all of them have come at this point.
The originals?
Yeah, I know we do have some of them.
Okay. But we do have copies of everything.
Yes.
Okay, any other questions from the about the assignments or the books or the tapes? Your computers will play a CD, won't they? Or somehow you can, okay, CDs for you may be as old as eight tracks. Right, maybe some of you will have to help me update this so that I can give you a thumb drive with all of these on a different format, but sometime.
Do you know if the sermons on the RFA website are the equivalent to the CDs?
It may be that they are. You'll have to check that. I'm not aware.
All right.
I would imagine that they are. All right.
No problem.
Now, excuse me a minute. If you have a Heidelberg Catechism sermon that you are assigned to preach for this coming semester, that's off limits for you in this study. Okay? Jacob knows his is Lord's Day 44.
I do now.
He does now. Matt does not know what his is because Prof. Dykstra has not assigned it yet. But I told Prof. Dykstra that if he doesn't assign it, then you're going to have you have it open. You may study whichever ones you want. He's going to have to confer with you which ones you listen to and study here. And then that's out of bounds for his assignment for the semester's sermon. Right? And then we'll each have a Heidelberg Catechism sermon this coming semester. Marcus,
Can we bring those CDs back home to listen?
you may.
Okay.
Yep. One other note before I continue, and that is you ministers who are visiting here, I would be very glad to have you bring up questions about an upcoming Lord's Day sermon that you're going to be preaching. Not this coming Sunday yet, but the following Sunday or two from now. If you would like us to discuss the Lord's Day in a special way, please suggest that to me. And it will help you warm up to that Lord's Day again, see things that you haven't seen before. So feel free to do that. All right? Okay, you all have heard of Elector Frederick III and his commissioning of the writing of the Heidelberg Catechism. What you may not have heard of is another Frederick whose infamy is as important as Elector Frederick III's glory and benefit. This other Frederick ought to be as dishonored among us as Frederick the Pious, as the third Frederick, is respected among us. The third Frederick that you might not have heard of before is Frederici, Isaac Frederici, an Italian, whose commission at the Synod of Dort from the Arminians was to oppose the preaching of the Heidelberg Catechism at the Synod of Dort. We who love the Heidelberg Catechism ought to know that name, Isaac Frederici. Frederici spelled F-R-E-D, Fred, Fritz for short, F-R-E-D-E-R-I-C-I. That name to us ought to be as black as the name Jake Harmson, a.k.a. Arminius. And the name Arminius among us who are Reformed is a dirty word. I was reminded of that recently when my wife accompanied a high school choir trip to Chicago. And when they got into Chicago, one of the young ladies in high school saw an Armenian restaurant and said, "I didn't know they had their own restaurants." Of course, she was confusing the ethnic group Armenians with the theological position of Jacob Arminius. And yet I was glad to hear what she said, because it showed she knew that the Armenians were our enemies. The name Frederici ought to have that opprobrium attached to it by us. As I said, Frederici attended the Synod of Dort, one of the representatives of the Arminians, the Remonstrants. He was a synodical delegate from Utrecht, so he was a Dutch from the Netherlands. And his unique distinction is the assignment to object formally at Dort, do not adopt the Heidelberg Catechism to be preached. Well, we all know that the Great Synod was not moved by his objections and quickly reinforced the mandate to preach weekly from a catechism and from this beautiful confession of Reformed churches. Frederici is representative of a long line of objectors to preaching the catechism. But now a footnote to this footnote. This is a little vignette, as it were, for you before I get back to the main teaching. A footnote to this footnote. Frederici did not object to preaching a catechism. Frederici objected to the adoption and preaching of the Heidelberg Catechism. And that little footnote of the footnote here is the reason for what I'm going to bring you now, the mandate and historical defense of catechism preaching. Did you hear what I said? You understand that? He was not objecting to catechism preaching. He was objecting to the adoption of this catechism to be preached in the churches. And the implication of that is very, very important. When I was first called to the seminary and assigned to come up with a class to teach as the interim class, it took me less than a minute to realize that I wanted to teach this class for the interim. Preaching the Heidelberg Catechism constitutes half of the sermons that a Protestant Reformed minister preaches. Aside from baptism sermons, when catechism isn't preached, and Lord's Supper sermons, almost every service in the morning, maybe in the afternoon, is a sermon on the Heidelberg Catechism. How many Heidelberg Catechism sermons do you think a minister makes per year? Have you looked? Have you counted your years in the ministry? How many per year? You look, and I'm guessing you'd come up with about 40 Heidelberg Catechism sermons, maybe a little bit more depending on the circumstances in your own church. That's our long and cherished tradition. The people of God expect you to do that. They love catechism preaching when it's done well, and we want to do it well. You might legitimately draw the conclusion that in the seminary, where you are required to preach 10 sermons before you graduate, 5 of them, at least 4, ought to be catechism sermons. And perhaps in the internship, where at least 3, I think the rule says, is that right? Of the 9 to 12 sermons that you preach, ought to be at least 5 or 6 ought to be Heidelberg Catechism preaching. But it isn't. And so it's not out of line for us to take special time to talk about not only the legitimacy of Heidelberg Catechism preaching, but the manner. And that's what you're most interested in, the manner of doing it. You can also know, by way of introduction to this lecture, that in the seminary, the homiletics course formerly was 2 semesters. Somehow, and I don't know how, that's lost in the mists of ancient Protestant Reformed seminary history, it was reduced from 2 semesters to 1. And so rather than having the time to deal at length with Heidelberg Catechism preaching, The homiletics instructor is forced to compress everything into one semester. And even though I let homiletics spill into the semester called liturgics, well, there are important things that we need to study with regard to liturgics too. So again, I gladly take this 8 days, a third of a semester really, to concentrate on Heidelberg Catechism preaching. Today I want to, in the time that we have remaining, about half an hour or 40 minutes, present the mandate that you have to preach the catechism and then give a historical defense of it. When I say a mandate and a history of it, I'm not talking about merely the history of Heidelberg Catechism preaching. You're all familiar with that. I'm not talking about the history of the catechism. You get that in Symbols course. I want to trace back the history of catechism preaching in Reformed churches generally, and in Reformation history, and then for reasons I'll show later, I want to trace the history of preaching catechisms prior to the Reformation. But I want to begin with the mandate to preach the catechism. What church order article is it? My brother is from Singapore that mandates you in Singapore to preach the catechism? Do you know? All right. You know that there is a church order article in the Covenant Evangelical Reformed Church that requires you, when you get, God willing, into the ministry in Singapore, you don't have any choice but to preach the catechism. And that's what we face in our churches too. I'm interested in seeing that mandate that others give, and then ask why in the world was that mandate given? The mandate comes to us in Article 68 of the Church Order. All of you have that handout. Church Order mandate for Heidelberg Catechism preaching in some Reformed churches in North America. If you don't have that handout, please ask me. It should be there. Perhaps it isn't. No? All right. If you would. I have a list here on that sheet of church order articles of various Reformed denominations in the United States and Canada. I have them for the most part in alphabetical order, but first look at the note I have on the top. The church orders of almost all Reformed churches, not Presbyterian churches, mandate preaching the catechism. The striking exception is the Reformed Church United States, one of the oldest Reformed churches in America, also known as German Reformed. The Heidelberg Catechism is one of the official creeds of the German Reformed, but a mandate to preach the catechism is not found in their directory of worship or in their introduction to the translation, a fine translation, by the way, of the Heidelberg Catechism that you may find on their denominational website. The youth in those churches memorize it for their confirmation, but the preachers do not preach it. So that explains the omission in this list of Reformed churches that mandate catechism to be preached. Article 68 of the church order in our churches, the ministers shall on Sunday explain briefly the sum of Christian doctrine comprehended in the Heidelberg Catechism, so that as much as possible the explanation shall be annually completed according to the division of the catechism itself for that purpose. Pop quiz, what is as much as possible? What is as much as possible? You may look, but I think there's been misunderstanding of that sometimes. What must be done as much as possible?
Have
completion of the catechism.
The annual completion, yes. Now, I think that as much as possible does apply to weekly preaching as much as possible. We've judged it to be that. If there's a baptism on Sunday morning, we're not required to preach the catechism in the evening if we didn't use the catechism for baptism sermon. And if there's Lord's Supper on Sunday morning, we're not required. So as much as possible, but it's not every Sunday as much as possible, but it's completed annually as much as possible. Think about that a little bit. Part of why I bring that up is that you mustn't say to yourself, well, I have the freedom to preach the catechism when I can, and I'm going to make that judgment when I can. No, you preach it. You preach it every Lord's Day, unless you can't. And you do that in such a way that as much as possible, you finish it in a year. And that's not possible, but you ought to aim for probably, what is it taking you to get through the catechism? 18 months, 24, year and a half to 2 years, right? The Canadian Reformed Church in Article 52, the consistory shall call the congregation together for worship twice on the Lord's Day. That's interesting. The consistory shall ensure that as a rule, once every Sunday, the doctrine of God's word is summarized in the Heidelberg Catechism, is proclaimed. CRC, Article 54B, at one of the services each Lord's Day, the minister shall ordinarily preach the word as summarized in the Heidelberg Catechism, following its sequence. Free Reformed churches, Article 68, you see they have very similar to ours. At one of the services each Lord's Day, minister shall ordinarily preach the word as summarized in the Heidelberg Catechism, following its sequence. That is, the numbering is the same as ours. The Heritage Netherlands Reformed and Netherlands Reformed have an article that is almost identical to yours. And I won't read it, but look at the reference to the catechism as the catechism which at present is accepted in the Netherlands churches. Well, that's Dort's language. At present accepted in the Netherlands churches. They've not modified their church order to reflect the circumstances in our country. The URC, in Article 40, one of the services each Lord's Day, the minister shall ordinarily preach the word as summarized in the three forms of unity, with special attention given to the Heidelberg Catechism by treating its Lord's Days in sequence. And you note that that's permission, if not mandate, to preach also the canons of Dort and the Belgic Confession. And the RCA, in their book of church order, the points of doctrine contained in the Heidelberg Catechism shall be explained by the minister at regular services of worship on the Lord's Day, so that the exposition of them is completed within a period of 4 years. I don't know that 1 in 100 RCAs follows that book of church order mandate any longer. Do any of you know? When Kevin DeYoung was still in the RCA in East Lansing, that's when he rediscovered the faith that they almost lost, right? What's his little book on Heidelberg Catechism? Almost forgot. The faith we almost forgot. And the little book he has, I have over there, it's reflections on the Lord's Days. It's not really an exposition of them, but that's reflective. His experience in the RCA is reflective of what's going on in that denomination. They don't preach the Heidelberg Catechism. Now, the mandate that is found in the church order comes to us by the church visitors. And this is not on the sheet that you have before you. But the church visitors every year are mandated to ask every consistory whether the catechism is being preached. And that's because we hold each other accountable in our ecclesiastical lives. And this is one way I am very, very thankful that we hold each other accountable. Here's the question. Is the Heidelberg Catechism regularly explained in the services for divine worship so that no doctrine is left unexplained? And every consistory must answer that question in the affirmative. We ask each other if we're faithful in teaching and preaching the catechism. Listen to what Shaver, in his explanation of the church order, says was a mandate some generations ago. The question came in this form. If you were a minister in that consistory, this would have gotten your attention, perhaps in a way that our current question does not get your attention. Does his work give evidence of diligent study, particularly his preaching of the Heidelberg Catechism? Listen to that question. Have the church visitors ask that to your elders in your presence or while you're gone. Does he give special attention and give good diligence to the sermons on the Heidelberg Catechism? Back when we were still CRC in 1902, we took a significant decision. And that was because of a laxity already then in implementing that mandate. We, with our fathers back then, said, quote, with a view to the dangers from without that threaten sound doctrine, and in consideration of the great need of and the very meager interest in the regular development of dogmatical truths, Synod emphasizes the time-honored custom of catechism preaching, and the classes are urged to give proper attention to this matter, that the regular consideration of the catechism may be observed. Now that brings us from 2019 back to 1902. We can go back further than that. In 1667, they discussed the mutual oversight concerning catechism preaching. And the Frisian classes, or the Frisian classis of Worcester, lamented this, quote, our Frisian people will perish like the Jewish people for lack of knowledge, end quote. And so 3 years later, the Synod of Friesland, 1670, proposed that at every classis and synod meeting, each church would be asked one by one, do you preach the Heidelberg Catechism? Do you preach the Heidelberg Catechism? Do you preach the Heidelberg Catechism? And it's way back then that began that practice in mutual oversight, church visitation, that the consistories were asked about catechism preaching. My experience, 20 years having church visitors come to us, was that I didn't think about this question very much. It was almost ho-hum. Well, of course, you're going to ask that question, and of course, we're going to give you an answer in the affirmative. We preach the catechism. From a certain perspective, that's a good thing. I don't hear even whispers today objecting to Heidelberg Catechism. I don't. I did many years ago, a little bit, but very little. It was mostly that there used to be objections to Heidelberg Catechism preaching. I pray that that's the case for you men, that you don't hear that. Our church visitors ask about it, and we all can say, yes, we do. I don't know of anybody even dreaming of an overture to change the mandate to preach the catechism, but it doesn't mean that there isn't any threat. And the threat that Heidelberg Catechism preaching fall away among us might come because preachers do it wrongly, might come because preachers do it poorly, and it might come because preachers go into the preaching occupation without understanding the reason for the mandate. I say, there may be a threat in our churches in the future if preachers do it poorly, preachers do it wrongly, or if preachers begin doing it, hear objections to it, and can't explain why this is a good mandate. But then why this is a good mandate must not only be in your heart and your mind, but it also must be passed on to the congregations to which you preach. And then you explain this to the kids in Heidelberg Catechism classes too. I'll tip you off in advance that what I mean by poorly is that the sermons are preached in a dry way where you are not convinced of the truth as an important truth. If you're analytical only and scholastic, trying to duplicate the Heidelberg Catechism as it's explained in the Triple Knowledge, cutting and pasting much of that into your sermons, that's doing it poorly. Or by doing it wrongly, if you take the foolish notion that this catechism does not need any scriptural justification, I'm just going to preach the catechism. I'm not going to refer to the Bible. I'm not going to base my teaching on the Bible. I'm simply going to preach the catechism. That's wrongly preaching the catechism. So let's look at the history of the mandate catechism preaching. I probably won't finish that today, but next week, Monday, and then we'll get on to some other matters with regard to how to and so forth. Reverend Decker.
Do you have a reference for that Shaver quote?
Yes, I do. Quote from Shaver comes from His Polity of the Churches, Volume 2, page 255. You might not know that Shaver is 2 volumes if you don't have both of them. You might have one, but on the spine of each is a little asterisk. 1 asterisk in Volume 1, 2 asterisks for Volume 2. This is found in Volume 2 of J.L. Shaver's Polity of the Churches. The history of catechism preaching, I'm going to treat in 2 parts. First of all, the history of Heidelberg catechism preaching, and secondly, then, the history of catechism preaching itself before Reformation times. I want to start, though, in the middle of Reformation times in 1563 in the Heidelberg Catechism. And I want to go in both directions from 1563. And now a little by the way. By the way, I'm not going to be treating objections to catechism preaching one by one. You've seen those perhaps. Each objection answered in turn. That gives priority to the objections, but I do want to note the objections perhaps, show what are the best answers to them. And this objection, first of all, I'm treating today and Monday. The Heidelberg Catechism preaching that you do is a novelty. The Christian church must not be guilty of being novel in their worship. You're novel. We don't want to be novel. We don't want to be a member of your church. One of the things that I say to people who object to catechism preaching in that way is, did you know, my dear friend, that your denomination from which you come always preached the catechism too? You just forgot that because your ministers don't do that anymore. And I would say that to them in love. And if they don't come from a denomination that formerly preached the Heidelberg Catechism, I would want to say to them, this is the history of the Reformed churches from the beginning. And if their response, perhaps because they know a little bit of history, is, well, that's only 500 years old, and the Church of Jesus Christ is 2,000 years old, it's still a novelty, then I would go to the second half of this historical defense and show that not only does Heidelberg catechism preaching have a good pedigree, but catechism preaching itself does. And then we'll have to say something to our Presbyterian brothers and friends who say, I'm not sure about that, because they do not preach the Westminster Creeds in their worship services. We have to ask ourselves, why not? But we'll save that for another time. So I begin the history of catechism preaching with the Heidelberg Catechism in the Palatinate. Philip Schaff, in his Creeds of Christendom, says 3 things about Heidelberg Catechism preaching. Number 1, the divisions into 52 Lord's Days in the 1566 edition shows that the Heidelberg Catechism was first preached regularly from that time on, 1566. 1566, 3 years after its adoption. Schaff says, number 2, that the divisions of catechisms divided into 52 Lord's Days dates back to Calvin, who predates the Heidelberg Catechism. Schaff says the division of catechisms into Lord's Days dates back to Calvin. And Calvin's dates, 1509 to 1564. Calvin died the year after the catechism was adopted. And then in the third place, Schaff says that catechism preaching was and is especially accustomed in the Dutch churches and churches of Dutch descent. Now, Schaff is only partly correct, as we'll see. The Heidelberg Catechism was officially adopted in January 1563. What's the birth date of that adoption? Anybody remember the date in January? January 19, 1563. A good date to remember. And was included in the church order of the Palatinate of 1563, which church order was adopted in November of that year. I have a copy that I got off Google Books of this Palatinate church order. And it's interesting to note, I'm sorry, not church order, but liturgy, the Palatinate liturgy and church order, which have the catechism written out in full in an explanation of what you do in the order of worship. This church order reads, and now I give somewhat of a paraphrase of that, translation by a local RCUS man, this way, quote further. It's going to be a long quote, so be patient. Listen, there's a lot of interesting things in it. Further, a catechism sermon shall be held every Sunday afternoon at the hour established in every locality in this way. First, after the song, the minister shall pray the Lord's Prayer and call upon the Lord for a right understanding of his word. After which he shall read the 10 Commandments before the people distinctly. Thereupon he shall instruct those in attendance who can hear with learning, and to whom the questions will be so preached, first for a time upon the text, thereafter also by degrees upon the chosen question part. Let me pause there a moment. Is that an early method of preaching the catechism? First, he says, upon the text and then upon the chosen part of the catechism. Just let that sit in your mind a moment. It says, preach to those who can hear with learning, to whom the questions will be so preached, first for a time upon the text, thereafter also by degrees upon the chosen question part. After this, he will allow several of the youth to recite a particular number of the questions in the catechism that they have learned in the school or at home, as it will be expounded in the future, and especially on the next Sunday. To give you an idea of how possibly to teach the Heidelberg Catechism, that the kids first learn it by heart and then they have it taught to them either on the pulpit or in the catechism room. Let that sit for a little bit too. Would they be able to learn better if they had memorized the words without understanding and then have you explain it to them? Or would it be better that you explain it to them and then they memorize it with some understanding? I think you can argue the case either way, but it's interesting to think of the possibility that they memorize it and then you come and explain it and they say, oh, that's what that means. Children don't have to understand everything that they memorize. We know that very well. But then after they've memorized it, they come and hear what it means. Okay? And when these have been recited in the presence of the congregation, the minister shall explain several following questions in a simple and brief manner, so that he shall preach through the catechism at least once a year. So preaching the Heidelberg Catechism was no afterthought. A letter from Ursinus, and now think dates and time, a letter from Ursinus written before the Palatinate church order was adopted has Ursinus complaining that he had so much work to do and he couldn't do it all if he were required to take the catechism sermon. Before the church order mandated him to preach the Heidelberg Catechism, he says, I'm so busy, I don't have time to take the catechism sermon. And then in the preface to the first edition of that catechism, Frederick urged preachers to inculcate it into, quote, the common man from the pulpit. And then he said this, quote, we do herewith affectionately admonish and enjoin upon every one of you that you do for the honor of God and our subjects, and also for the sake of your own soul's profit and welfare. Thankfully accept this proffered catechism, and that you do diligently and faithfully represent and explain the same according to its true import to the youth in our schools and churches, and also from the pulpit to the common people, that you teach and act and live in accordance with it, in the assured hope that if our youth in early life are earnestly instructed and educated in the Word of God, it will please Almighty God also to grant reformation of public and private morals and temporal and eternal welfare. Now, even before this was the history of preaching catechisms in Calvin's Geneva. Calvin wrote at least two catechisms, one before he was expelled from Geneva and the other after he returned. The one that he wrote before his expulsion from Geneva was based on Luther's larger catechism. You might not think that Luther's large catechism has anything to do with Heidelberg Catechism preaching and any helps that you might get in that regard, but you'd be mistaken. Try to come up with a copy of Luther's large catechism. Calvin's was modeled after this, of course, differing in certain key respects. And then his second catechism has the same form as the Heidelberg Catechism, at least in questions and answers. The catechism, this second one, was published in French and Latin. Now think about that. What language did they speak in Calvin's Geneva? What language did the common people speak in Geneva? What language did the scholars use in Calvin's Geneva? Well, the common people spoke French. The Latin was reserved for the preachers and the scholars. Which edition do you suppose is divided into Lord's days? Not the scholars' Latin edition, but the common people's French edition, because Calvin assumed that this catechism of his was to be used for preaching each Lord's Day. Now, it's true that it was divided into 55 Lord's days, but that's not because they believed there were 55 weeks in the year or that they didn't think it should be preached each week. It was to be preached. The Church Order of Geneva, 1541, think 20 years before the Heidelberg Catechism was adopted, the Church Order of Geneva prescribed 3 worship services to be held each Sunday. The middle of these, beginning at noon, was, quote, the catechism service. Church order said this: at midday there is to be catechism, that is, instruction of the children in all 3 churches. But now the instruction of the children was not children without parents, but children who were accompanied by the schoolmasters who had taught them to memorize the catechism, and children brought by their parents, all of whom would hear these catechism sermons. Before that, in Luther's Germany, now does a pattern begin to appear in your mind? In Luther's Germany in 1527, 10 years after he published his 95 Theses, Luther himself went out on a kind of church visitation. You maybe heard the story. He was so disappointed because he found such appalling ignorance, and he couldn't figure out why. Well, he found out very quickly why, because the ministers who had been formerly priests hadn't been trained to preach and teach the people. So Luther took his sermons that he preached on the Apostles' Creed, the sacraments, the Ten Commandments, and the Lord's Prayer. Luther took his sermons that he preached. If you know the Catechism, the Heidelberg Catechism, this is amazing. Sermons he preached on the Apostles' Creed, the sacraments, the Ten Commandments, and the Lord's Prayer, condensed those sermons into confessional form, published them in a book, gave them to these ignorant priests, and said, read them to the people, teach these to the children. In one of your services, preach a text from the scripture. In another service, preach the catechism. Luther's Germany, 1527. 10 years after he published the Theses, but 40 years before the Heidelberg Catechism was adopted. I say again, does a pattern begin to appear? They were preaching catechisms before the Heidelberg Catechism was adopted. All of the churches were. So if you take that book, the larger catechism, the large catechism of Martin Luther, that's exactly what this is. Except, typical with Lutheranism, it begins with the Ten Commandments, then goes to the Creed, the Lord's Prayer, baptism, and the Lord's Supper. But if you think that Lutheranism is bad because it puts the law first, read Luther's explanation of the commandments, and you will see he had no inclination to make the law a basis for their salvation, even though they put it first in the catechism. And everyone knows that in the Heidelberg Catechism, the Ten Commandments go way at the end of the Creed. And that led to the Church Order of Wittenberg instructing the catechism to be preached already in 1533. Every Sunday, the priest or the deacon had to preach from the catechism. The only difference between Lutheranism and Calvinism in practice was that in Lutheranism, the sermons themselves were provided. In Calvinism, the catechism was the starting point from the sermon. You want to jump ship? Your catechism sermons will be provided for you. You can read them to the people. Well, I don't think anyone wants that among us. And that was the beginning of 2 centuries of catechism preaching in Lutheranism. How the RCUS lost that practice is something that if any of you learn, I would like to hear the answer to. The German Reformed churches do not preach the Heidelberg Catechism. But let's go to the Netherlands now. We're all aware of the history of catechism preaching in the Netherlands, where it flourished and from which tradition we receive our mandate to preach the Heidelberg. I'll just make a beginning of this and then we'll close for the day. Peter Gabriel is known for the first documented use of the Heidelberg Catechism for preaching. Peter Gabriel, a minister in Amsterdam, did that in 1566. But it seems that Gabriel was not alone in that practice. He was one of several Dutch Reformed ministers who had begun at that early date regularly to preach from the Heidelberg Catechism. Several Dutch synods encouraged the preaching of the Catechism. The Synod of The Hague mandated it already in 1586. As early as 1574, a question was put to the regional Synod of Dort about catechism preaching. Quote, the answer to the question whether it would be good that homilies based on the catechism would be made as follows. This shall be left as it is, that is optional, but it would be good. When's classes? next Wednesday? Think next Wednesday, what might happen at classes next Wednesday. 1574 said it would be good if the ministers in an orderly manner take turns in the classical meeting to explain in summary form a question or two from the catechism, and in this way teach and sensitize each other and also learn to explain the catechism thoroughly to the congregation in an orderly and edifying manner. You think classes meetings are long now? Have them take turns preaching a sermon on the Heidelberg Catechism. Well, that was in the days when that was not known very well how to do it. And I understand that the Lord has given us much, much more since then. All right, we are 5 minutes from the hour of being finished. Let's close by singing a Psalter number again. And I'll pick up on Monday morning, God willing, at that point. Someone have a Psalter that they would like us to sing?
$394.
394. All right, think of each generation to the next shall bear testimony. That's the second stanza. All right, let's do all three stanzas. I will extol thee, O my God, and praise thee, O my King. Yea, every day and evermore, thy praises I will sing. Great is the Lord our mighty God, and greatly to be praised. His greatness is unsearchable, above all glory raised. The words. Each generation to the next shall testimony bear, and to thy praise from age to age thy wondrous acts declare. Upon thy glorious majesty and honor I will dwell, and all thy grand and glorious works, and all thy greatness tell. Thy mighty acts and terrible shall men with awe confess. Of thy great goodness they shall sing, and perfect righteousness. Most gracious and compassionate is God who reigns above. His wrath is ever slow to rise, unbounded is his love. Next week, Monday morning, 9 o'clock. God willing, all of you can make it again. Jacob, can I ask you to close with prayer for us today, please?
Yep, let us pray. Our Father, which art in heaven, thou who hast chosen unto thyself a church from before the foundations of the earth were laid, thou who in the fullness of time didst send thine only begotten Son, Jesus Christ, to redeem her and to merit for her and earn for her all the blessings of salvation. And thou who by thy Spirit, by the Spirit of thy Son, dost apply all these benefits unto us through faith, which is a gift from thee, to be so that we might glorify thee and enjoy thee forever. To thee we give thanks. Thanks for revealing these things unto us, for opening our ears, softening our hearts, and pressing thy promises thereon. And we thank thee too for the Spirit's work throughout history, leading the church into that truth. even through the development of creeds and confessions, which it is our privilege to enjoy even today. Grant, Lord, that through this interim we might be led to a greater love of the Heidelberg Catechism, for we sense in it not only the work of men, but the work of the church in whom the Spirit works. And grant that we might embrace it and from it declare the precious truths of Scripture as they are so wonderfully and beautifully put therein. Bless us now as we go our separate ways in this day. Grant unto us strength and grace for the work which thou dost have before us. Forgive the sins that we have committed in this day, and forgive that depravity which always cleaves to us, and against which we must struggle all our life long. Blot out our transgressions, strengthen our faith to believe thy precious promises, and stir us and renew us daily by thy Spirit to lead new and holy lives before thee. In Jesus' name we pray all of these things. Amen.